The Extremist Publishing podcast is endorsed by Heart 200, Scotland's most exciting road trip. Find out more at heart200.scot.
Hello and welcome to the Extremist Publishing Christmas podcast. I'm Tom Christie, and it's my pleasure to be joined today over a mince pie and some mulled wine with Stirling's Borough archaeologist, lecturer, research fellow, author and all-round good egg, Dr Murray Cook.
Thanks for that, Tom. Remember, you've got a PhD too.
And that PhD may just come in handy today, Murray, because it's on the subject of Scottish literature, and our topic is going to be Scottish traditions of Christmas.
Very good. Look forward to this.
Now, for those who don't know Murray, he is an expert in archaeology of Scotland and has written widely about Scotland's history. And that's going to be helpful for us today because our topic is going to be the history of Christmas celebrations in Scotland and sometimes further afield. So without further ado, Murray, Christmas, as we know, has long-lying religious foundations because it was initially Christ's Mass. And we know from historical accounts that a lot of Christmas traditions go back some way. We see Romans singing the early Christmas carols, or the earliest precursors of Christmas carols, because they had festive hymns around the 4th century. And as early as the 11th century, we also see accounts of people decorating their homes with holly and ivy, the holly to signify Christ's crown of thorns, and the ivy to celebrate the evergreen nature of the Christian faith, that is to say, everlasting life. But really, it takes us to Tudor times, I think, before we start to see the modern Christmas start to take form. Do you think that's right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. We should remember the main Christian festival is Easter, when Christ rises from the grave. But Christianity, as we understand it today, has been very good at adopting and building upon other traditions. So Easter is a pagan festival. Christmas, the 25th, is the birthday of Mithras, clearly building on northwest European traditions of needing a bonfire, needing a feast when it's actually cold and dark. So all these things are built upon to celebrate and actually to carry forward Christ's good news.
Now, an interesting thing about Christmas, and historians like Lucy Worsley have written about this, is that there is a fairly subtle difference between how the English Tudor court celebrated it and the Scottish court of the same time. We have phenomena like mummers, for instance, who would have been probably your neighbours or other people from your community who would come around your house in masks or other kind of disguises and wouldn't talk. They would hum, hence the name. And generally they would try to cheat you in games of chance like dice, which doesn't seem to have really caught on in Scotland, whereas other things like the Lord of Misrule and Christmas carols are known to both countries.
Yes, I mean there are subtle divisions. As all these things, national pride is an issue, and actually there is rivalry between Scotland and England, and actually Scotland sits right in the middle for several hundred years, international warfare between France and England. So, I mean, the Lord of Misrule in England, we have the Abbot of Misrule. It's the celebration of the Feast of the Fools. Both countries are Catholic, and both drawing upon European traditions, and the royal families are marrying into each other. So you're going back. David I's sister is Queen of England. We can say Alexander the Third is married to Edward I's sister, etc., etc., etc. By the time we hit these kind of Tudor times, of course, James IV marries Henry VIII's sister. And obviously, Mary Queen of Scots is Henry VIII's great niece, or grand great niece, precisely how we do that. So there is interconnection between these families. They're operating in a European Catholic system. Everything is common, but they are choosing differing ways to celebrate things.
Now, the interesting thing about Christmas carols really is that in terms of their ultimate tradition, there were carols for many other holy times of year, including Michaelmas and Easter. It's only that because Christmas carols have survived into modern popular culture that we remember them as being specifically a festive season phenomenon. But famously, Henry VIII wrote some Christmas carols of his own, which have been rediscovered by musical historians. Are there any similar musical traditions in the Scottish court of the time?
Well, there are certainly poetical traditions. So James I is writing poetry. We know James the Fourth is writing poetry. The King's Quair is the most famous of them. I think we really see James the Fourth and James the Fifth as patrons of the arts. James VI is writing poetry and kind of polemical accounts, we know, against witchcraft and against tobacco and smoking. So the kings are meant to be educated individuals at the head of a society. They're patrons of the arts, and of course, when both countries are Catholic, they are invited. The Scots kings are inviting the religious orders. So obviously James I invites the Dominicans, James IV invites the Whitefriars, and society as a whole is imbued with these things, with a rich textural diversity, with lots of things going on, richly decorated buildings, richly kind of plays are being patronised, poetry is being patronised. I mean, you can get a feeling for some of this from some of these works. Dunbar and Sir David Lindsay, for example, write extensively. They're not writing about Christmas, they're writing about fun and games in the court, and actually a celebration of the kind of power and majesty of an independent kingdom in its last kind of bright kind of explosion of mirth and frivolity.
And one other factor that was probably synonymous with the Tudor Christmas was, of course, their festive finery. And one of the things that they enjoyed were mincemeat pies, which had been around, I think, since around the 13th century, so it would have been well established by that point. But they weren't mincemeat pies as we would recognise them.
No, I think our mincemeat pies are actually, they're still a luxury. All those heavily sugared fruits, spices, exotic ingredients. I mean, remember getting a mandarin in your stocking, which was actually, that was the time of year you were getting them. They were exotic. So the mincemeat is meant to be expensive, luxurious supplies. That's our mincemeat, but of course in the past it was just a heavily spiced pie with lots of rich ingredients, and you end up, of course, with, I mean, it's a feast. So that's what feasting means, and of course it's a religious feast. So there is there are religious connotations to all of this too.
And the spices in the mincemeat pie, of course, meant to signify the frankincense and myrrh that were brought as gifts to the Christ child in the Nativity.
Yes.
So fast forwarding a century or so, and Oliver Cromwell is on the march, and he's cancelling Christmas, much to the horror of anybody who enjoyed a bit of bacchanalian fun and frolics.
There is, yes, indeed, and of course, famously, the ban on Christmas is actually retained in Scotland, and indeed, my father remembers Christmas being a holiday for children. Men in his family went to work on Christmas Day. He worked on Christmas Day as an apprentice, but actually, this kind of dour suppression of joy was common to the Presbyterian Church, and certainly that first gasp of the Reformation in 1560, you can find references to ministers almost joyfully banning things. Dancing on the Sabbath, pipes and fiddles at weddings. Even as late as 1699 in Stirling, someone got into trouble for gardening on a Sunday, not properly observing. And people that were in the Western Isles in the 80s or very, very early 90s and earlier will remember not being allowed to play football in the park and swings being chained up. Actually, this was about observing the Lord's Day. Quite a contrast to what was going on before. I think I told you about the abbot of Misrule and one incident during James V's reign. A series of hijinks culminated in the cow of the park keeper's wife being shot by the king. If the cow survived, I don't know, or if there was compensation paid, I don't know. But there is a contrast there. There's a considerable contrast, even with the dour 17th century and the Victorian Christmas that we kind of have adopted, a la Dickens.
And that kind of Presbyterian sobriety has lived on. I mean, there are so many interesting stories. The famous one, of course, being the woman who always took the swing out of her budgie's cage on Christmas Day so that it couldn't enjoy itself and couldn't have a bit of fun. But yet, Christmas Day wasn't a bank holiday in Scotland or recognised as such until the 1950s, and a lot of people outside of Scotland don't realise even Boxing Day didn't become a bank holiday until 1974.
Yes, I mean, for us, to a certain extent, still to this day, Hogmanay is the bigger and the more impressive holiday. And certainly I remember my mum and dad and grandparents talking about literally 2 days of partying, that they would go from friend to friend to friend to friend, and they would actually, their house was abandoned for 2 days. No one was going to come back. And I know the things that accompanied that: redecorating ahead of the clock, the various traditions, the tatty, the lump of coal. This also, it had to be said, suited the military and the authorities, especially during World War II, because the Scots didn't want Christmas Day off, but the English did, and this made the management of troops a bit easier during the war period. You always had someone fighting.
So then we come to the Regency period, and I was surprised, as I'm sure many others have been, to discover that it wasn't Prince Albert who originally introduced the Christmas tree to the United Kingdom, but actually Queen Charlotte, who was the wife of George III. And the Christmas tree goes back to, I imagine, the 16th century, where it was really a Lutheran tradition. And I think that's when we first see trees being brought into homes, candles being hung from their boughs. But it takes us until the Victorian period and Prince Albert really to see that tradition take root.
Yes, I mean, you've got to remember, Queen Charlotte was unpopular, of course, and there was quite a scandal. And then during this Victorian period, we end up with this kind of culmination of everything. Victoria as the stereotypical, the idealised mother, the idealised family, drawing upon German traditions, and then, of course, Dickens, The Christmas Carol. All these things actually make kind of a marketing dream, and there's simply a snowballing of effect, and we, Coca-Cola plays some kind of role within all of that. The red and the white for Santa. It just becomes a juggernaut, ending up with what we recognise today.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mention Dickens, because he has been popularised in recent years as being the man who essentially invented the modern Christmas, because he brought so much of it into his writing and into pop culture, largely because of things like, for instance, Christmas cards, invented by Sir Henry Cole around the same time as A Christmas Carol was emerging. Yes,
I mean, one of the things about the Christmas cards is there's actually a famous one from Stirling, which shows a scene of the Old Town Cemetery in the middle of winter, and it's they just can't bring themselves to kind of abandon the idea that this is a religious holiday, that there is something sober about it. I mean, the card is a cemetery, and one almost feels it's saying, kind of wish you were here. But it's they just can't escape what should be happening.
Another thing which is interesting is that after Dickens and Queen Victoria, we see really in the 19th century, certainly the mid to late 19th century, culinary traditions starting to emerge with turkey and with figgy pudding. But Scotland has its own festive tradition in the form of the bannock cake.
Yes, I do remember. I mean, I've eaten them, but it was something that had escaped me. I think possibly because I'm not entirely certain I like them.
But amongst the Christmas crackers and the traditional Christmas carolers that we start to see in the late Victorian period, it's amazing to consider just how many of these traditions have survived into the modern day. I mean, we consider things like, for instance, the traditional Christmas colours of red and green and gold, symbolising Christ's blood shed at the crucifixion, the green of the everlasting life, and the gold of royalty, which in turn parallel the story of the Magi. It's interesting, isn't it, that with nativity plays taking a back seat and with church attendance falling, that these traditions have continued?
Well, they are, but I think they begin to be almost bereft of meaning for many people. They are simply what Christmas is. I mean, to a very large extent, modern society is created in that kind of, what some people would call the first genuinely period of globalisation, the 1880s to immediately prior to World War One, where it's possible to communicate with America across the Atlantic cables. You've got foodstuffs coming from all over the place. Britain is the predominant superpower at this point, and really no one challenges Britain. So that idea of British culture, and then the writers that popularised that and actually packaged it, and as you said, Dickens the best of all. But wherever you want to go through that period, you've just got a world dominating message. And of course America, which is was to be the next superpower, very much adopted British traditions at that point and actually ran with them. So we can see Christmas, we can see Halloween, actually based upon Scottish and Irish traditions, and actually to a certain extent English traditions. That tends to get overlooked, and they're actually they've become global brands, global events, and it all starts in that late Victorian Britain.
Well, staying with Charles Dickens for a moment, one tradition which is often forgotten about, certainly outside of the British Isles, is the fact that Christmas was a time for ghost stories in England, and it's something that's been popularised quite recently because the BBC have picked up on this, and there have been a few ghost stories in recent years televised, but not so much in Scotland. It was more of a Halloween thing here, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean, but even the ghost stories, if you actually go back through, there are clearly ghost stories in Scotland, but if you were actually trying to think through them, there's a handful of spooky poems in Burns, who are of course late 18th century, but the great ghost stories are probably Buchan, and of course Buchan is writing after M.R. James, who popularises the Christmas ghost story, and actually par excellence, because of course he was writing them immediately prior to the period to be told to friends and colleagues. So again, what are becoming British traditions is going worldwide, but I think, as you say, this one is an English tradition.
And no discussion of Christmas in Scotland or anywhere else would be complete without good old Father Christmas. And that's an interesting thing actually, because I imagine most people know the connection between the Christian character of St Nicholas leading through to Sinterklaas, as the Dutch call them, and of course Dutch immigrants to America carried that tradition over to Santa Claus. as we know him today. But Father Christmas was a different kind of character. I think, if anything, he was probably closer to Dickens's Ghost of Christmas Present.
Yes, certainly that would be my impression. I mean, I think one of the odd things is actually when you go through early 19th century and 18th century Scottish literature, and there is a body of them, and I'm obviously touching upon your area here, Tom, but Christmas doesn't loom large in any of the poetry, in any of the accounts. I would struggle to find anything coming anywhere close to A Christmas Carol, let alone a mention of an actual typical Scottish Christmas. Even Halloween, which we're obviously sometimes more familiar with that. Burns's poem Halloween actually features nothing that we might recognise as contemporary. It doesn't even mention turnip lanterns, for example. There's more something to do with looking at the roots of a kale stalk to find your future. So within, whenever this change took place, and I'm pretty sure it's pretty rapid, in around 1850 forward, it's a dramatic turnabout for our Christmas and what it became.
Being Scottish and having lived in Scotland most of my life, it seems that Scottish Christmas traditions are quite unusual in the sense that in some ways they're very modern, but they're still harking back to very ancient source material. Yes,
I think the trouble is that I think a lot of these practices are fire festivals, and actually they end up with a focus around Hogmanay and the New Year. So the Stonehaven and the Burghead fire festivals, which are the most dominant ones. These used to take place in Edinburgh as well, balls of fire, and actually presumably much more common, and equally other things like Beltane were being kind of hammered out probably late 18th, early 19th century. So I think a lot of these pagan precursors or pagan origins of, or even Catholic traditions that survived long enough through the Protestant period, were finally vanishing, both in as the ministers cracked down, but also as Scotland became more clearly part of Britain, more clearly part of the British Empire, and actually a kind of global society. And you took some of these things with you, but of course they have to survive in the new world in Scotland, the new world in America, the new world in Canada, and only the strongest traditions actually carried forward.
And it's interesting you mentioning these ancient fire traditions, because here in the local area we have Comrie with their Flambeau Festival, always popular around about the New Year. But I suppose as well, one other benefit of Christmas being a truly international festival is that it does give us this wonderful opportunity to sample different cultures and to appreciate the products of those cultures. And I think that's why European markets have become so popular around about Christmas time, here in Stirling and further afield.
Absolutely. I mean, if we are, Christianity was probably one of the world's first, in fact, genuinely the world's first kind of global religion. If you look at its origins in the Roman Empire, and today there's obviously a tussle between Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam. But actually, those we want to share. I think personally we should be sharing things. Christmas is a good period to actually reflect upon what the world has to offer, what unites us rather than what divides us.
Well, Murray, in the true spirit of the season, I would like to raise a glass of sherry and wish you and your family a very happy Christmas and a wonderful New Year in 2021.
Thank you very much, Tom, and the same to you.
Murray's book, The Anvil of Scottish History, is available to buy now from all good independent retailers and online booksellers worldwide. And there's still time to get my own book, The Golden Age of Christmas Movies, which details really the foundation of the Christmas genre in cinema from the 40s and 50s. Both of them are available from Extremis Publishing. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you too have a wonderful Christmas, and I look forward to joining you again in the new year.
If you would like to find out more about advertising on the Extremist Publishing podcast, please visit their website at www.extremistpublishing.com for details.